First, let me start by giving you a brief in general about the apparel industry. The apparel industry is a global industry. It's a migrating industry, and it tends to migrate to low-wage countries. When you look at the literature in economics, they even call it, they have an expression for it, they call it a race to the bottom. A race to the bottom. That's not very romantic, but this is what it really is. And it's more beyond low wages. They refer to attempts of governments to appease investors at the degree that they actually might relax environmental, economic, and even tax regulations. And that, of course, comes with a social cost. Now, this is first. It's a very labor-intensive industry. It's also very outsourcing intensive. Usually, when you have a labor-intensive industry and a very heavy outsourcing, this is a recipe for labor abuse, because you could hide it into the value chain. And it's never a first tier. It's never a second tier. It's always a third tier. And you're very cost-driven, especially when you talk with very simple items that are very cost-driven, that you get a supplier every year coming and it's going to tell you need to cut your cost or cut your price, which is the case. I mean, in Egypt, most of the time, and developing countries, most of them, they deal with simple items that are very price-driven. So now, to give you this, what I'm really referring to are really terrible working conditions. Most people would refer to a typical apparel industry, apparel factory, as a sweatshop. If you go there, you'll understand what we're talking about. And please don't go to Magdi Tolbas or to the type of fact. I'm talking about the majority of them. This is the case. I'm very much involved with something called business and human rights. When I talk about business and human rights, one of the major centers in the world is called New York Stern Business School at New York University, Stern School of Business, and they have a center for business and human rights. Now, if you go search, you're going to find that they have lots of reports about apparel industry in Bangladesh. I had the privilege of meeting the research director. We were comparing notes. And I was telling her about situations in Egypt and in Jordan that I'm very aware of, and it's exactly what Bangladesh is. The only difference is that Bangladesh is, you're talking about 10 billion. So from a materiality point of view, they are on the radar screen. We are not on the radar screen. I'm talking really about not so good conditions for laborers, even when you get expats. I mean, we talk about the Gulf countries that they put expats in crowded conditions. They confiscate their passports. As far as I remember, 2008, 2009, we were doing this to laborers from Sri Lanka, laborers from, etc. Now, so where do you go from this? Where do you go from this? I remember it is very problematic to detect problems, because if you go to a nice factory, most of the time you're not going to be able to find it. Any violations. Violations, again, are very much outsourced, a second or a third degree, so it's very hard to detect. The only examples from, I used to sort of, I started the QIZ unit from 2005 until 2009. And during my tenure, I only found 2 people who do serious audits. One of them was the US Custom and Border Control, and it was not for the purpose of social audits. It was really for the purpose of verifying that a factory is really producing what they are producing in Egypt, and it's not submarined. The other one, which is an interesting example, was Gloria Vanderbilt. So they will go to the factory, they will check the number of restrooms, for example, available, the fire safety. One of the most drastic disasters in industrial age was in 2013. It's called the Rana Plaza. Rana Plaza is a big factory. It's an 8-story building in Bangladesh. It was hosting 4 or 5 companies, and the whole thing collapsed. And one of the major issues was there that there wasn't enough exit. exits for people to exit. So you're talking about 1,100 people who died. Could this happen in Egypt? Yes, it could. It could. Now, so you're talking about social audit, and it's expensive. And I think part of it also is that what do you do with the expense if you're a private company? You're going to pass it to someone else, the customer. If the customer is not willing to do this, what are you going to do? Again, you're getting back to the type of products you're producing. If you're producing a product that has a reasonable price in it, I'm talking about top products, not the type of denim that you will buy from a Walmart or that every year that they want to cut more on the price. I mean, those guys, this is a cutthroat. And usually the victim are the laborers. Now, interesting enough, there was a case also closer to home, which was in Jordan in 2006, 2007, in New York Times, an article. And the article is titled, "An Ugly Side of Fair Trade, Sweatshops in Jordan." This was a major catastrophe then, and I remember King Abdullah, he was just Ukraine, with Queen Rania. They went and they met with buyers in New York, and they were calming them, they're going to take care of things, and et cetera, et cetera. I think it's a matter of materiality. Again, our scale on the global map does not put us on the radar screen. But still, it's a good hygiene. I mean, remember, the purpose of investments, the purpose of development is the well-being of everybody, including stakeholders, including laborers. And I think we have to put that in mind. And it's a responsibility of everybody. I'll conclude with one interesting example, which is the government, the role of government. I mean, of course, the role of government is very important in putting policies, procedures. Again, to provide decent jobs, you really have to provide living wages. There is a big difference between a living wage and a minimum wage, especially in a country like Egypt, where it takes you ages to change the minimum wage. And if you're a business owner, you have to understand this. I mean, if you want to get laborers that are really loyal and they're really productive and they're going to actually work to help you, then you really have to pay them living wages and you have to provide with a decent job. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I'd like to maybe catch up with another question, which is maybe what's the role of the private sector in this? You've mentioned the government. I mean, does this have to be on a governmental initiative? For instance, the quality control, the social audits, do they have to be on a national level, or they could be, because here it's about mainly the private sector, and this what we need to see now more dynamic in this, the qualified industrial zone. It's the dynamo of change, social change, economic change, technological. So what do you think the role of the private sector would be in problems like that?
Okay. Let me simplify it. The solution to this is ecosystem governance, period. What do I mean by ecosystem governance? There is a role for the government because the government puts the policies, the procedures, the laws. But then there is a role of private sector because they do this, they implement. But there is a third dimension, which is civil society. And part of the civil society, by the way, are unions, labor unions. I mean, part of the ILO decent job mandate is the right of collective bargaining of labor. I'm talking about unions because the union are the one that's going to push. Now, how do you get the balance is because of the interplay of the three of them. So I don't expect the government to do it alone. I don't expect the private sector to do it alone. I don't expect the civil society or the labor unions to do it. By the way, interestingly enough, when you talk to most of the people in industry, I had only one exception, and without mentioning name. The guy actually went to the laborers and he was asking them to form a union. And his justification was, he was telling me, Ali, I mean, it's very easy for me to deal with 2 or 3 who are elected instead of having to deal with 1,000. So his justification, we're in the same, but this is very different. I mean, most of the time when you look at people, they try to avoid collective bargaining, because it's a headache. But again, it's about good governance. Good governance results in a stabilizing and a good point as an ecosystem. Thank you.
And actually, good governance will not come except there is collaboration. It's a collaborate model.
Yes.